Thanks again for having me, Metro. I'm really excited today to talk about the services that we build around data management and reproducibility. And I guess kind of the services that are involved with data librarianship at large. So I am the librarian for research data management and reproducibility at NYU. I'm also the subject area specialist for data science and computer science. I've been in this position since August 2015. A long time. So I've been building services around these core concepts over the last 8 years. Oh my God, it's a long time. So this is going to be like a bit of theory, a bit of lessons learned, and some advice for building services around data management and reproducibility. So at NYU, I am a faculty member in the libraries. I work in the data services department. Again, I'm a subject specialist. I also teach data librarianship at Pratt every fall, which is pretty fun. And my whole job revolves around sort of guiding researchers, patrons, through the process of making their materials understood in the future. So today we're going to talk about like the services that you can provide to help with that mission, how to build those services, and then again, feel free to ask me anything as we are going through, and we'll definitely have some time for Q&A at the end. So in case you didn't come to the first session of this two-parter, or it's been a month or a few weeks, so let's do a little recap. These are the summary of data management practices, like the good practices that we are hoping to help people with for this type of work. The first is around storage and backup, making sure that patrons both know the best practices and have the infrastructure around that. Using things like open file formats to help with sustainability and making research more accessible, using consistent structure organization, documenting everything that has to do with the research. Even things like uniform file naming are really important around navigating materials later down the road. And transparency, so working as transparently as possible to minimize that human error. When we add reproducibility on top of that, you do everything that RDM does. And then there's this last sort of bit of the computational dependencies part, right? Like it's hard to get something that runs on Mac to run on Windows and give you the same result. So when we think about reproducibility, some of those tools that can help us with that translation work can be really effective. So a little bit of a summary from last time, just in case. So now let's go on to the types of services that are most commonly provided around data in GLAMs, in galleries, libraries, archives, and museums. The first is collection development. So this is literally like collecting data, code, software, or other useful platforms or materials to be used in research, teaching, and learning. Reference and instruction, the most of what I do, like 90% of what I do is I feel like sometimes is reference and instruction. It's a lot of one-on-one and group consultation work, a lot of workshops. A big part of that as well as outreach and community building. So fostering those communities of practice where people are using data for their work, seeing where we can help them solve their problems or work to try and solve their problems. And building and maintaining infrastructure. So this is like, how can we as the libraries facilitate and library workers facilitate different infrastructure to solve different problems in the life cycle of research? I'm going to start with collection development, even though honestly it is a bit of the least discussed, I think, aspect of providing data services that can help with some of providing data services in general. This can be pretty critical because there's a lot of really useful data that could use mediation and could use curation. And so collection development involves things like selecting and acquiring data sets for patrons, either from them themselves or through vendors. To be able to successfully do data collecting, though, you need to have some infrastructure to be able to like store the data, because vendors will give it to you in lots of different forms, and you kind of have to accommodate that or try to find a way to accommodate that. Some policies and procedures that just reflect the reality of how to work with data, like you can't download 5 terabytes from a web browser. So maybe if we have a large data set that we want to provide to patrons, we need to think of a procedure to do that and some infrastructure to do that. And then a little bit of knowledge. So a little bit of knowledge about what your patrons need and use. And this could be gained through talking with other people, as well as just your own, through your own consultations and work. Making sure that you can open the data and look at it when it's received from a vendor and be able to look at its quality, making sure it has things like documentation, and being able to explain it to people and explain how it works. So collection development requires a few things, and I think a lot of it comes down to policy. So when we think about collecting data, we want to think about the scope and what materials are a fit for the collection. So what are our selection criteria to evaluate different data? What would we say no to? And with data, this is often the hardest part because there is no shortage, again, of like data brokers and data vendors and places to acquire data from. Being discerning is really going to be the key part. Of course, this dovetails nicely with patrons' needs, right? We need to define and gather patrons' needs. We want to proactively collect as well as reactively collect. And then the uniqueness. So we don't want to collect something that's like publicly available somewhere else, right? It doesn't make sense. So we just want to make sure that we're collecting things that would be really hard for our patrons to get otherwise. I really like Geraci et al.'s like checklist for selection criteria for data. I definitely heavily recommend looking at it. I think if you've done collection development, it should look pretty familiar. I think the things that are a little different are this technically usable on patrons' computers. So obviously when you're selecting things, you want to make sure it fits the needs, it fits your service plan, it fits your policies. But again, if it's 5 terabytes of data, your patrons probably aren't going to be able to just download that off a web browser and be able to use it on their computers easily. So we have to come up with some mechanisms for either doing that, or we can say no to that data if we can't find a way to make it usable on people's machines. Something I always want to look for is alignment between the vendor's business practices and the institution's values. And I really like this piece about ethical financial stewardship in libraries that really speaks to that. And then easy access to data while making sure patron privacy is honored. So we want to make sure that when we're bringing on new platforms, especially platforms where people can do analysis work on data, that their privacy is protected the same as anything. So we want to weigh these trade-offs between these different choices. And I always like to document why we choose one over the other, but this is a big part of the selection criteria is a big part of obviously building a data collection. And then we have to think about things that are kind of more content related, like how often does the data get updated? How often do we need to like be on the hook for that? Do we need the data to be recent? Is it okay if we get it once a semester, or do researchers need it up to date to the minute? What are the security provisions? So there are lots of data sets that have very identifiable information. Like at NYU, we license something called L2, which is a voter file. So it contains information about voters on the individual level. It's highly identifiable. And this is something that we have to obviously have strict security around. So that's something you definitely want to take into consideration when writing a selection policy or looking at data you might want to collect in a library context. And then the quality, like, is it high quality data? And part of that is the documentation. A lot of vendors want to give you data with very slapdash documentation. This makes it really impossible to use. It makes it impossible for the researcher to really have confidence in how this vendor created or gathered the data. And it's critical for reproducibility that we're able to produce sort of the provenance of the data that we're collecting for the libraries. We can say, this vendor spliced together these data sets to get to this. Like we have to be able to, the vendor has to be able to provide that, and we should be able to also provide that in turn to the patron to support their research integrity. And then, yeah, so that's right. And then a lot of it is workflow related. Like I mentioned, some of this stuff is more just about those day-to-day practicalities. What is the format of the data? Is it in a format patrons can understand, like CSVs or JSON, or is it in some weird format the vendor made up? Like obviously that's going to weigh differently. Something that's funny for data is that it can come just in a variety of different delivery methods. Like there are some data sets we collect where the vendor mails us CDs. And so we kind of have to have some considerations around how we deal with that. And then some things we collect does require particular software, like this screenshot is from our spatial data repository. And you can see there's a number of different file formats there, and there's even an open in Carto button, which lets you open it in a GIS tool. But because there are these other formats there, it can be opened in pretty much any GIS tool. And that's something that we considered when we took on this collection. And then documentation, again, super critical for reproducibility as a part of our data collections. And then how are the patrons accessing us? Are we getting a copy of the data, or are we leasing access to data? This is pretty critical because, for instance, hosting data locally can be a lot faster for people than having to go through a vendor's platform. So those types of considerations for data are important to look at. I'm not going to go through this big table from Geraci et al., but they did a great job of sort of going through the steps of working through a data collection, what the skills and what the day-to-day work might be. So for the service, you might, the patron-facing part of it might be around helping users locate and use the data, helping people understand that documentation and code books. Like one data source that we license is called IPUMS, and it's a big data source that has a lot of like demographic information, and you have to make specialty extracts because it's so big. And so I help people navigate the documentation for that as a part of dealing with that data collection. So this is a great thing, and the Geraci et al. Paper is very nice as well. There are also some great examples of data collection policies out there, like, and I listed a few here. These two, the UC Santa Barbara and the Ag Data Commons, are specific to agricultural data and social sciences, whereas the other ones are more generic. And Virginia Tech also just published a retrospective on their data purchasing program, where they would just purchase data for people who requested it. And I don't have a link here, but we should find a link and get it because it is really interesting. Another key part of supporting research and supporting research sustainability and reproducibility is providing access to and teaching around software. So licensing software is a very common part of data services that we see. It's usually a big collaboration with like IT in terms of contracts and deploying it. This is a screenshot of the software we support at My Data Services. Something that we put a lot of effort into, and something I think is really useful, particularly when you're thinking about reproducibility and sustainability, is supporting and using free and open source software and free and open source tools. I think it's a great first step, especially if you have no resources, like you can't buy Qualtrics or any of the ArcGIS programs or anything like that. I think looking at those free and open source tools are, in general, very sustainable. Like if people leave your institution, they can still take those skills with them. It's a low-cost way to do some data-informed teaching and outreach and programming for you yourselves. And they are like highly used in research. Like all of these tools that I've listed here are Jupyter, Python. You've all heard of them. They're pretty widely used. So just a note that the types of software that we choose to support and that we focus on can also have some impacts on putting reproducibility practices into our own instruction. And that's a good segue into talking about instruction. So reference and instruction with data, like I said, is a huge part of my job. It is a wonderful way to inculcate research data management and reproducibility practices across lots of different parts of the community and of research practices. A lot of reference interviews and reference interactions around data involve managing expectations. Like I love this image from the Partlow paper that I quoted here. This image is, the text says, "I need data on Hmong employment and educational attainment by state over time." And the expectation, and this is the expectation I see quite a lot, is people think you're just going to Google this sentence and come up with data that is just going to be immediately usable. And that is never the case. You have to, in reality, in this case, go to that data source that I mentioned before, IPUMS, read the documentation, create an extract, make sure that it is what you want, and then get to your analysis. So reference in a reference for data related requests is often, first of all, many steps. It's usually never one and done type of appointments. And it's usually a teaching moment. Like it's a teaching moment on a number of axes. I really like this quote from Partlow where they mention, in fact, when the patrons come to us, they may have never encountered data in the wild before, which is a very good point. We might be their first entree into even working with data. And this other quote from the rest of that paper, the data reference interview needs to reflect the tension of both providing service and instruction. It is usually not sufficient for the model to include only the elements of helping a patron to determine their need, and then either getting them to the data or pointing them in the right direction. Usually once they get to the data, then it's a whole other set of steps of like, okay, the analysis, the data management, the how do I reproduce things, especially from collected data sets. Like there's just a host of other related requests that derive from one, such that when you're providing data reference, again, it is usually going to be multi-session, and it's going to be, it's not usually gonna be like, here's a link to the data, enjoy. I wish. There are some useful things, in addition to your normal set of reference questions that I'm sure everyone has a bank of. When you're dealing with like helping people with their research or their data related requests for their work, something I always ask first is sort of what's their core question they're trying to answer, and what's their anticipated analysis? Like, are they using a particular tool? This might mean that they need the data in a particular format, or they need help with from a particular other group on campus. So I always try to get a feel for like the elevator pitch of their research and their anticipated workflow. From there, I drill down to sort of ask the who, what, where, when, and how much. And the how much is and maybe an oddity for data where it's literally like the volume of data. Some research requires just like, it doesn't matter what the content is as much as the amount. So if you want to do some, machine learning on emails, you need 20 million emails. It doesn't really matter where they come from. Some of these other provocations will help you drill down to narrow sources for finding data and for places for additional instruction and help. And then ultimately, what are they going to do with the results of this? And is it going to be for classwork, a publication? And depending on the answer, they may need to pay more or less attention to things like licensing. But also depending on the answer, I might want to offer a little bit more instruction on different areas. Like if they're going for a publication, I may say, down the line, when you're ready to publish this research, come back and we can help you with the repository side. Like each of the parts of a data reference interview gives you entree into advocating and informing about different areas of support across the research lifecycle. Another key thing that I just do a lot of, and that is a very key part of providing services for data management, are data management plan reviews. This is like usually a one-on-one consultation that I have with people, although it can be a group, obviously. And this is just a random public data management plan. It's not from anyone at NYU or anything. It's just an example of what these documents look like. Data management plans are essentially 2-page documents. The max usually is 2-page. And it's a requirement of grants, both federal and many private agencies. And it basically describes how the researchers will manage their data throughout the course of a grant-funded project. And then at the end, how they will share and publish and preserve that data and code at the end. Also, what's described in the data management plan can be used for budget justification. So in a lot of grant a lot of grant programs, you can say, I'm going to deposit in XYZ repository. And if there's a fee for that, you can then put that in the budget. So consulting on these 2-page plans is a great first data service to provide, like a great first reference service to provide or consultation service. It really just requires kind of a knowledge of those RDM best practices. All of the federal agencies have their requirements online. They're all very similar. And as long as you sort of know those best practices and talk with the researcher, it becomes very evident where you can make suggestions in the data management plan. So for me, I do think this is like, if you were starting 100% from scratch, you want to have a data services, I would say like this is a really good first service to provide. And basically what my workflow is even now, and it was this way when I started out in 2015, this was the first thing that I did was just provide data management plan reviews. And I think maybe I taught one workshop for like a year. But they would send them to me, these 2-page documents. I would mark them up and comment on them. And then we would have a follow-up where we just sort of discuss my comments and make sure they make sense. The other thing that you can help with this and is a good add-on to this type of service is promoting and using these tools like DMP tool, which is a great open source tool maintained by California Digital Library that provides a lot of templating for data management plans. And so it's really useful because it goes according to funder, like the NIH plan is the most popular template on DMP tool. We've used it really heavily. I send the template directly to patrons and ask them to fill it out. And what's useful is because NYU is a member organization, we can do feedback like right in the platform. But even if we weren't a member organization, people can still use it for free, can still use the guidance in DMP tool to help enhance their plan, and then still export it to send to all of you to do your reviews on. So highly recommend DMP reviews as like a good first service in general, especially if you're starting out. So instruction, and sorry, I'm zooming by, but hopefully this is useful. So data-focused instruction, for me, I really think that it should be meant to fill practical gaps in a curriculum. Things that you might see from patrons, either through surveying or just through your experience in reference. This can take many, many different forms. So obviously there are regular classes within the library. This requires library computers to have the right software, the right setup, the right tools though, which might be a blocker. But this is something you can just regularly schedule on your own. What's useful if you're in a university context is having these embedded courses. So having faculty members tap you in and say like, hey, can you come to my class to talk about reproducibility with R? Like, yeah, of course. I'll be there for an hour on this day. See you then. I also, my personal favorite thing to do nowadays are these specialized workshops for student clubs. Like I recently had the undergraduate data science club ask me to teach introduction to Git. And it was a really great way to see a group of students, undergraduates, that I don't typically see. Providing workshops at conferences is another great way to provide instruction. I actually used to do an introduction to reproducibility for the European Geosciences Union. It was pretty random, but very, very fun. Got me in front of a lot of different folks across different disciplines in geosciences to talk about some of those roadblocks and barriers. And then I would say in general, data librarians are really good about openness and sharing. So if you are just starting out and you want to provide like introduction to RDM, everything that I do is openly licensed, and there are many, many other data librarians who do the same thing. So you're definitely in a good community where a lot of data focused instruction is openly licensed and openly available for everybody to draw from. I really like this project, the Data Information Literacy Project. It should be data info lit, not data lit info on my slide. But this project, examined lots of different teaching methods for data-informed courses at different universities and then compared the pros and cons. So there's the mini course at Cornell. an online course at Minnesota, the One Shot, which we all know, in Oregon, and then Purdue had an embedded librarian and a workshop series. And these have different trade-offs, especially when you're just starting out or wanting to build data services. Maybe the One Shot is the only thing you can do, and I do think One Shots are very important. But when we're thinking of the best ways to impart different practices around data management, around reproducibility, around just sustainability and sharing of research, these courses can provide different things. Like an online course might be a great catch-all, and it might be something you provide just asynchronously, you just have, while still doing these one-shots, or while still trying to do a mini course with a faculty member. I actually did a mini course with a faculty member at the University of Utah. It was an intensive for a summer. It was a 2-week course. The faculty member taught in the morning, and I did the practical part in the afternoon. And it was a really nice way to collaborate. Obviously, it needs buy-in, it needs investment. There's a lot of advocacy that went on before I was brought on. But it was, I think, really effective overall. Like, so we can think about these different ways of providing data-informed instructions for different purposes, for different audiences, and for different specific practices. I was also an embedded librarian when I started at NYU. I was half-time in the Center for Data Science, and it's definitely not scalable, but I have a lot of really wonderful experience from that too. So all of these, again, have trade-offs, and there's something that you'll have to grapple with as you build services. An online course might actually be a good way to start. I like this just underscore from Lisa Federer in this blog post about data literacy instruction, which I think resonates to everyone across every institution, which is that researchers and students are very busy and not likely to commit to something like a 7-session data literacy program. Nonetheless, it's important that they learn how to manage, preserve, and share their data, not only because many funders now require it, but also because it's the right thing to do. Thus, my challenge has been to design a one-off session that would be applicable across a variety of fields. And I think that's shared across all sort of data management and reproducibility instruction, because the best practices remain the same. Everyone needs to document things. Everyone needs to use sustainable file formats. Everyone needs to store their data correctly or safely. But the way that those practices get individualized is really where some of that tension lies. So data-informed instruction can be really useful the more that it's targeted and the more that it's practical, like hands-on. But that can be really difficult to balance with some of these other needs. So a little bit about that. Something we've tried in data services is around these online resources. So in the summer of 2020, we did a project around the Black Lives Matter movement and trying to create train the trainer almost resources, so that we might not have the bandwidth to teach an embedded course, and our students might not, our learners at NYU might not have the time and availability to devote like a workshop session or an online course around these things. So what we did instead was we developed data into formats that can be used by lots of different people. We've created data and lesson plans around those data for people to use. And that's a screenshot from there on the right. So this is something that we've tried to do to sort of marry scaling up with teaching with data. Outreach and community building. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this because it's the bread and butter of a lot of library work. It's a critical part of building community. I think outreach can be, like I mentioned, either really targeted or very wide. And I think both have a good place in data management and reproducibility concerns, which again are shared across a number of fields. A lot of even the cultural concerns are shared across a number of fields, like the problem of the pace of grants publish is shared across everybody. So I think we can do very drilled down events, which are very effective for different fields, and we can still have these really wider conversations that are inclusive. These are just 2 examples of screenshots. We do Love Data Week every year at NYU. And then also in 2016, I just held like a 1-day symposium around reproducibility. got a lot of people from a lot of different parts of the university in one room to talk, and that was really useful. Some other like data related events, and I really like events as a means of doing outreach almost more than anything else. So I focus on it pretty heavily. I had a lot of fun doing a datathon, and it's like a hackathon, but basically you give students or anybody a data set and say, go wild, show me what you can do with it. And so we actually ran one of those in my data services with a student club, and it was really fun. It was a great way to see the creativity of the students, to talk about, hey, when you're working collaboratively on your datathon and you need to share code, maybe you want to, write down what dependencies you're using, talking about reproducibility. Or you might want to document exactly what you did and why you did it, so you don't waste time discussing things you've already discussed with your partners. Like, each of these events has a way to embed these practices we're trying to share. Love Data Week, like I mentioned, it's an international week. Anyone can participate virtually or in-person events. The Carpentries, if you haven't heard of it, is an organization that focuses explicitly on workshops. And if you're not a member of the Carpentries, you can still host a workshop and have somebody come teach it for you at your institution. I think it's a really great way to sort of gauge interest and gauge what people need, especially if you don't have a teaching program around data in place right now. Something fun that we did recently was an Ask Me Anything, an AMA session. We grabbed a faculty member that did some interesting research around data and just had folks come and ask them questions about it. It was really fun, and it was kind of an unstructured way to talk about some of those issues with working with data. Symposiums, like I mentioned, it's usually like a longer form, more formal event. And then the Brown Bag, a great like informal lunch series, free food, they just have to listen. It's a good way. I think the University of Madison's research services did this in a great way. They had a series in 2017. I'm not sure if they did the series again, but they had this series in data management where they invited faculty to come and talk about their practices and how it benefited them. And I think hearing from others of the same field about how these practices we're trying to promote have helped them is really a good way to inculcate the practice across the campus or across your institution. I think word of mouth is the most powerful approach. It's not scalable, but it is how over the 8 years I've kind of feel like I've really gotten my service to where I've gotten it. It has to be, you have to have like relevance and demonstrate that, and you have to realize that that conversation looks different to different people. So for instance, my DMP review services are very highly used among anthropology PhD students, because they just I helped one student who told everybody else, and now everyone comes to me, which I love. And it's kind of a tradition. I've seen it over the years. New PhD students still come to me. And that is 100% the word of mouth, because they're like, you can materially help me get grant money by reviewing my data management plan. And a lot of what you'll do as a part of that is switching jargon. So I'm just going to talk about this last service that people usually provide, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about the building of the services. So infrastructure is sort of the last piece of the puzzle. There's lots of different ways that you can build and maintain infrastructure in support of data management and reproducibility. I, again, just pointing to open infrastructure as a great way to live some values and as a great way for sustainability. Something that on the right are some ways that you can, or some different infrastructure projects that might be interesting. Things like interacting with different discovery systems. So if you have a repository, maybe you send your data to different metadata aggregators. Maybe you facilitate data transfers between different institutions. Providing access to collected data requires a lot of infrastructure that we will either have to collaborate with somebody to get or stand up ourselves. And we need it for our patrons as well as ourselves. And I'm sorry for this diagram on the right, but it's a mock-up of a curation workflow whenever somebody wants to deposit into NYU's repository. And we have a lot of different systems and infrastructure that interact with each other to let us do that. Like in this graph, you'll see Qualtrics, you'll see LibAnswers, you'll see Globus, which is a data transfer tool, and then all our actual repository software. So we need it for ourselves to disseminate collection, to do discovery work, and our patrons need it as well. Like it doesn't help if we're the only ones that have this infrastructure. Our patrons need to be able to make use of what we are providing to them. I also just want to make a quick plug for data curation as a growing service. Data curation is really all about making sure that before something is publicly available, it has gone through a review, somebody has looked at it, has said, yes, it has documentation, yes, it has open file formats, it's following all of those data management best practices. It does require some more infrastructure, like you kind of need a place to put that data, like a repository, before you curate it. And I just want to make a shout out to the Data Curation Network as a great way to get a step into the data curation service. So the Data Curation Network, this is a little diagram of how it works. It allows you, if you're at a member institution, if a researcher wants to deposit data into your repository, to send that data out to the rest of the network. So if me at NYU is really good at curating geospatial data, and Stephen at CUNY is really good at curating text data, I might send all my text data to the network and Stephen might curate it for me. And so it's a really nice way to share the load of curation and share competencies across different institutions and across a member network. So I really like that as a great way to augment the infrastructure you might be thinking about. This is just a page of my dream repository, and I feel like I always have to show it when I talk about infrastructure because there's so many things we can do with institutional repositories, like integrating them with tools for reproducibility, which I've put on these buttons on the right-hand side. Those are all open source tools for preservation and reproducibility that I think we could, like start to provide actual links to from a repository. So that's kind of like a next gen reproducibility support for a repository, but it's something I think about a lot. And a little warning before I go on to the building of the data services part is just a warning to resist reducing data services to just buying technology or getting technology. Any success that I've had and that I've seen in the field has come from relationship building, 100%. You can't start a service without doing that requirements gathering. You can't sustain infrastructure without a service to support it. And, that service includes instruction, reference, consultations, things like that. So now that I've given a ginormous overview of all of the services you could possibly ever want to do, let's talk about how to do it. Like, let's talk about the strategies for building up a data services and a little roadmap for doing so. So if you have no data services at all, or if you have one that hasn't been updated in a while, I don't know, your service catalog hasn't been updated in a while, I really think this is a pretty good roadmap for how to build a data services or how to build any services around data. And hopefully this should look like it makes sense, but the first step is to see what everyone else is doing. To do an external benchmark, like picking some peer institutions and seeing what they're doing and where we can improve. The next step is doing an internal survey. So now that you've seen what everyone else is doing, what do people at your institution need? Is there something that is not represented in the wider world that you might be able to take up because you've heard it from your patrons? The next step is to do some of that policy work and documentation work, testing and building. You got to iterate. So, start small with some impactful services and then build as you can gain resources and capacity. And then I put outreach and evaluation at the end, but it sort of underlies the whole thing. You want to market your services really heavily, and you want to constantly evaluate and reevaluate them to see what's working and what you want to change. So step one, to do some external benchmarking. I think this is critically important. Actually, my job at NYU came about because of an external benchmark. So this is something like picking some peer institutions, picking some criteria, and then go looking and seeing where everyone falls on those criteria. So like every 4 to 6 years at NYU, we benchmark, and it's a benchmark between the libraries and IT. Multiple people participate. The last one was in 2020. These were the 12 areas that we benchmarked. Obviously, I participated in the research data management one, but you can see there are some others that relate, like data repository services, data viz, digital humanities, quantitative service, and secure data environments. So we benchmark across a lot of areas. We start off with some very general criteria, like, do they have hands-on support for data management? Can someone sit down and get help with data management? Do they do consultations and classes? Do they have interfaces for different tools? And then we get really specific. So this is a anonymized screenshot with fake data about those specific criteria. So this is about governance. We say, like, do they have any policies about data? Do they have partnerships with data repositories? Do they, are they present in different advisory boards like the IRB? Do they have anything related to data ethics? Like, so these are the types of things that we then get into. And we did a 1 to 4 at NYU here. You can do it however you want, but we kind of tried to translate them into these tiers to see where do we line up in comparison to everybody else. And then the key part of this is then using those tiers to advocate for yourself. So like, okay, to remain a tier, whatever, what do we have to do? Probably have to spend a little more money because you'll fall behind if you maintain at this point. If we want to move up a tier and be like some of our other peers, this is what you need to do. And then if you want to move even higher, this is what you think we need to do. And this is a really, like I said, a really useful exercise in order to advocate and do some evidence-based advocating. You can see what everyone else is doing. This is how we need to catch up. But I love this warning from Dorothea Salo. I think it makes the part about internal surveys, which she says, unless we proceed with a clear understanding of researchers and their data, as well as our own systems and habits, we will simply trip over ourselves. Research data are too important and our role in curating them at present too insecure to allow that to happen. So we really have to pay attention to these internal surveys, talking to everybody and talking to them about the different contexts that they're using and working with data. So patrons of all types and all levels, those colleagues like your fellow librarians, your research administrators, and talking to them about the different contexts, like using data in a classroom is different than research, is different than using it for personal edification or growing your own skills. For colleagues, I usually ask, what requests are you getting around open scholarship, data management? What are the biggest roadblocks to research that you're seeing? What are the possibilities for things like infrastructure? What is used the most? For patrons, I really like the data curation profiles list. It has a list of questions around how researchers deal with their own data. And it is a very useful basis to have some conversations about how to support them and really provide services where there are big gaps. And data services of all kinds is meant to be connective tissue. Like, none of this can happen in a vacuum. Building data services requires talking to many, many different people. And this is, again, another big chance for advocacy, marketing and outreach, and to build those opportunities for joint services or events. Like recently, I spent a lot of time building relationships with our institutional review board at NYU. And as a result, I was able to get some of their language to change around depositing human subjects data in an appropriate repository. So that was a really good outcome of building that relationship and doing that sort of internal surveying. Like I said, step 3 is getting your documentation up. I tell researchers, if you can take one thing from me, it's that documentation is important. And I would say that to all of you as well. So having service guidelines is critical. Having policies around data governance is critical. And these will be really heavily impacted by your campus politics and culture. So this is our service guidelines at NYU. We hate saying no, but we need to. Obviously, we can't do everything. And these are just one way to communicate to patrons what to expect. Like, we actually don't assist with outside employment, externships, paid consultancies, and we actually don't offer deep methodological support either. So we try to outline that there. I think when you're talking about creating a data services plan, there are some great things you should include that sort of build on each other. And I'll let you read those bullet points, but I'll just go quickly to Oregon State University's strategic agenda. I really, really like it. They went very in depth with how they plan on building their services. You'll notice the first step is that internal survey. They want to then, and each phase is outlined with the leads, the partners, and you can see in the partners, they want to collaborate with the OSU Press and the research office. They have a timeline, they have different activities, and they have measured outcomes. So I really would put in a big recommendation for reading this strategic agenda as a good way to think about doing some planning. And then the last thing is this building and iterate. So I've listed all the services you could possibly ever want to provide. Pick one and do it for the next year, see how it goes, and then pick another one and do it stepwise. You want to do this by leveraging existing resources like different infrastructure, the expertise and interest of your patrons, and those relationships. So for me, like I mentioned, doing data management plan reviews was the great first step. Then the next one was doing workshops by request. If faculty wanted to have an introduction to data management in their class, that was my next step. My next step from that were some more regularly scheduled workshops and the carpentries. Then I started doing data collection. Data collection wasn't till sort of a bit of the end for me, but that's kind of the point. You build slow and small. And with data stuff in particular, you will fail, like you'll get nobody showing up, and that's totally fine. You want to take a really flexible and introspective approach because these are things that have social consequences. Like a lot of the issues with reproducibility are social ones. So when we think about programming around this and services around that, sometimes like you just got to try again. And piloting different tools, piloting different ways of doing instruction is going to be really, really useful for you. So just turn it off and on again, you'll be okay. So in summary, pick your first few years of your data services based on your internal and external scanning. And again, the part one was those lists of services you might consider. Relationship maintenance and building is a key to success of any data services. You want to iterate on all your approaches and service build in steps and ramp up as you can. So I'm happy to take any and all questions. You can reach out to me at any time. I'm more than happy to do that as well. I'm Vicky Rampin everywhere. And yeah, thanks.